lesson 9, non-stimulants. Now I'm going to say ahead of time, this lesson is a little bit longer because there's a lot of background information that we have to get through just to help you understand and get a good foundation for this classification of medications. But hopefully it's good information and you'll be able to take it and appreciate it pretty well. So, over the past decade or so, there's been an increase in the development of non-stimulant medications for ADHD. However, the use of non-stimulant medications for ADHD is far from new. In fact, many non-stimulant medications have been used for ADHD as either mono-therapies, meaning used by themselves, or as adjunctive treatments along with stimulant medications. In this lesson, we're going to review a few of the most common medications. But first, it's important for you to realize that many of these medications are used off-label. What that means is that some medications used for ADHD are not FDA approved for ADHD. Now, I know that sounds odd and somewhat concerning to many people, especially when you first hear it and first realize what's going on. But let me explain what that means. For a medication to be FDA approved for a condition, it must undergo a great deal of scrutiny and examination. Several rounds of randomized controlled studies are necessary and can take years before they are formally approved for the use of a medication for any particular condition. While this safeguard is there to increase the likelihood that a medication is safe and effective, it can also delay the availability of needed medications to patients today. So in a way, the time-related issues are addressed by physicians by affording them the opportunity and freedom to prescribe any medication currently on the market for any condition, as long as there is some scientific and medical justification for doing so. Let's think about what that means. If a study found that an acne medication, for example, causes patients to become sleepy, a physician could, technically, use that medication for patients who have sleep problems. While I know that sounds ridiculous, in reality, that is how many of the medications used in psychiatry were developed in the first place. In lesson 8, for example, I spoke about Benzedrine, an amphetamine-based medication approved by the FDA as a nasal and bronchial decongestant in the late 1920s. A decade after it was approved, a physician found that it was beneficial for kids with ADHD and inattention and academic problems. Following that observation, boom, an explosion in the development of and identification of stimulant medications for ADHD. So it was found accidentally. The same thing happened with antidepressants. Researchers in the 1950s discovered that a medication for tuberculosis elevated the mood of patients. Following that observation, boom, the explosion and identification of medications for antidepression and for dealing with serotonin and other chemicals often associated with depression. Amazingly, around the same time, the same thing happened with antipsychotics. Again, in the 1950s, physicians working in psychiatric hospitals discovered that psychotic patients who were administered a particular medication for anesthesia showed marked decrease in psychotic symptoms. By 1975, more than 15 different antipsychotics were developed that mimicked the effects of that original anesthetic. Now, while I know this is a course about ADHD, and I use those examples for two reasons. First, the 1950s must have been an amazing time to be a physician, especially a psychiatrist. Ritalin came out in the 1950s, so we have the start of treatment for ADHD. Antidepressants became prevalent in the 1950s. Antipsychotics were discovered in the 1950s. It is almost unbelievable how many innovations and discoveries came about during that one decade. It is almost like the planets aligned in just the right way so that all these discoveries could be made. Now, the second reason I mentioned those other medications is because that is the reason, the good reason, physicians are, one, encouraged to write about their findings on medication side effects, because you never know what old medication could benefit new diagnoses and new conditions. And second, physicians should be allowed to read articles and papers written by other physicians and researchers and understand the effects of medications so that they can use them off-label to help their patients. Although there is a history of this causing unforeseen problems because of other yet unknown effects of the medications, the overall effect of this allows its continued practice and allows it to be a practice used by physicians to ensure that medications are used for their patients as needed. All right, now back to our regularly scheduled ADHD talk. One very common class of non-stimulant medications used with ADHD are actually antihypertensive medications. All right, so medications for blood pressure. For as long as I can remember, antihypertensives, especially Catapres or Clonidine, and another one called Tenex or Guanfacine, have been used in conjunction with stimulant medications in treating ADHD symptoms. These medications are in a class called alpha-2 agonists. Fancy, I know. But the bottom line is that they affect norepinephrine and improve blood flow. So while they are technically medications for cardiac problems, they are very commonly used in ADHD. Historically, these medications would be used in the evening. The child with ADHD would take their stimulant medication in the morning to work throughout the day. Then, in the evening, the physician would prescribe one of these antihypertensives for the patient to help them relax and then go to sleep. As time passed, however, research increased in the use of these medications as mono-therapies for ADHD, so as medications that you use without the need for stimulants. As this research developed, in 2009, the FDA approved a new medication called Intuniv. It's an extended-release formulation of guanfacine, and the FDA approved it as a monotherapy for ADHD. Now, many of the pharmaceutical representatives that I've spoken with from Shire, which is the company that developed Intuniv, but also develops medications like Adderall, actually recommend the medication to be used in conjunction with the stimulant. Nonetheless, there are students who do fine on Intuniv and find it very effective in managing their ADHD symptoms. Now, prior to the development and approval of Intuniv, another non-stimulant medication was approved from a different class, and that medication was called Strattera, or the generic name is atomoxetine. I think this came out in 2002, and although it was initially developed and researched as an antidepressant, Strattera's effects on norepinephrine led to a shift from depression to ADHD. Atomoxetine is a type of medication called an SNRI, so a selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. So this calls for a very brief neuroanatomy lesson. I promise it won't be too challenging, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of an understanding for this, but also for other medications that fall into this broad category. When neurons release neurotransmitters, the cell does not really have a way independently to turn off. It just continues to release chemicals until something tells it to stop. So to address this, the cell that's releasing the chemicals has receptor sites called reuptake sites. And what it does, and the importance of these reuptake sites is, as the cell's releasing its neurotransmitters, the more that it releases, the more diffuse, the more the neurotransmitters float around in the intercellular space between the neurons. If too many neurotransmitters are floating around in there, the neurotransmitters actually find their way back, floating through those chemicals, find their way back to the originating cell. When they get there, there's these reuptake sites there prepared to take them in. When those reuptake sites are stimulated by the collection of neurotransmitters, that is a cue to the cell, hey, you need to stop. You've released way too many chemicals. We can stop production now. And so these reuptake sites, in essence, say, you've done well enough. You can stop producing neurotransmitters. So when there's a concern that a brain is not producing enough of a chemical, we want to try to create a situation where it continues to create those chemicals. And so one class of medication or one type of medication that's developed are called reuptake inhibitors. And what that basically means is it blocks those reuptake sites. So now there really isn't a kill switch. There's not a switch to turn off the cell, so the cell will continue to produce it. Now, when we've heard of this with things like Prozac, which is a SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And so what that does is that blocks that reuptake site for particular types of serotonin so that the brain continues to produce serotonin. Similarly, when a person takes Strattera, the reuptake sites for norepinephrine are blocked, and so the brain continues to produce norepinephrine. All right? Hope that helps with a little bit of that neuroanatomy. So while Strattera was FDA approved for ADHD, it's important to note that it is not a medication that will be effective for most patients. I've heard rates ranging anywhere from 30 to 50%, meaning that while stimulants may work in as many as 90 to 95% of patients, Strattera may only work for 30 to 50% or so. My observations suggest that Strattera is best when there are co-occurring depression or anxiety symptoms. Another major difference, and something parents and patients should consider, is that unlike stimulant medications which begin to work immediately, again, effects seen within 30 to 45 minutes or so of taking the medication, Strattera has to build up in the system and can take 2 to 4 weeks before any effects are observable. So when a parent is looking for something to help their child immediately, Strattera is not likely to be the medication of choice. It works well for some, but certainly is not the medication for all. In addition to non-stimulant medications that are FDA approved for ADHD, physicians also use other medications, again off-label, to treat ADHD. These medications come from a variety of classes, including antidepressants and even antipsychotics. While these are not typically prescribed, depending on the presentation of the patient and any co-occurring diagnoses or symptoms or anything like that, patients may be prescribed medications from these other classes. For example, when a patient with ADHD has trouble with depression or anxiety symptoms, the physician may prescribe an antidepressant, an SSRI or some other type of antidepressant to help deal with those symptoms. Antidepressants such as imipramine, Wellbutrin, some of the SSRIs, and many others are used for these non-traditional ADHD presentations. Similarly, antipsychotics are used when the person with ADHD has serious mood dysregulation or aggressive tendencies. Again, not the typical presentation of ADHD, not the traditional symptoms that we think about with ADHD, but when we have these non-traditional presentations and these non-traditional co-occurring symptoms, sometimes these other treatments are necessary. There are many other prescription and over-the-counter medications used in the treatment of ADHD. There are those who recommend the use of caffeine, which of course is a stimulant and should theoretically work similarly to the stimulant medications that are prescribed by physicians. Another interesting treatment for ADHD is nicotine. That's right, nicotine. In fact, when I was an undergraduate psychology student, my first research experiences were with 2 studies in the Department of Psychiatry. One examining the efficacy of 7 milligram nicotine patches as a treatment for ADHD, and the other looking at nicotine patches as a treatment for Tourette's disorder. Both studies were with children and adolescents, and both find modest improvements. I know many adults with ADHD who do not smoke cigarettes, but use low-dose nicotine patches to effectively manage their ADHD symptoms. My research in this area suggests that treatment with nicotine is unduly controversial. Our brains are hardwired for nicotine receptors. That's why they're so addicting. That's why people who smoke cigarettes and do those kinds of things to get nicotine have a difficult time quitting. But since nicotine is so intricately married to tobacco, and we know that the use of tobacco products increases cancer risk, nicotine therefore has a negative image that it perhaps leads to cancer. This isn't true. This isn't what's correct. This isn't the way that it really is, because what causes the cancer, of course, is the toxins and tars and things like that that are inhaled through the smoke. And even with smokeless tobacco, it's the irritants, it's the stimulation from the substances, and again the tars and the toxins that are in the tobacco that are put in the lip or in the mouth that are most likely the carcinogens that cause the cancer. Nicotine, at a modest level and used therapeutically, actually has a lot of therapeutic benefits. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this, I will provide some other materials for you to read over, and maybe a couple of links for you to be able to explore that. So as we wrap up this lesson, I'm going to take a moment to reiterate the pros and cons of non-stimulant medication use. Certainly, the primary factor in favor of their use is the fact that they, of course, are not stimulants. While stimulants increase heart rate and have the physiological effects on the body that we talked about in the previous lesson, non-stimulants may be as effective for some patients without those side effects and without the warnings associated with the stimulants. Another factor in favor of non-stimulants are their use in patients with non-traditional ADHD symptoms, including depression, anxiety, and aggression. On the other hand, non-stimulant medications, quite frankly, are not as effective as the stimulants for most patients. Moreover, they take time to build up in the system and can take several weeks before you start seeing any efficacy, and before you even know if you're going to have to increase the dose or make any adjustments. So, in sum, I encourage parents and patients to do their homework anytime they're considering medication for ADHD. Keep an open mind and resist the urge to read too much into the material online. There are those who are very passionate about medication use for ADHD, both for and against. There are things that you will read that will scare you, especially if you're not careful and you're not really attending to the sources of information. So do your homework, read reputable sites, and talk to others who are using these medications. I talk with patients and parents every day who use medications for ADHD symptoms. Some do very, very well. Others do moderately well. Those who don't do well tend to be those who stop the medication use, and then we find another avenue. Those who do well on the medications, again, our focus is on the non-traditional and non-medical treatments. We will be spending a lot more time talking about that in Unit 4, which is probably the main reason why you took this course to begin with. So come back for Unit 4, that's coming up next, where we're going to talk a lot about non-medical treatments and really start focusing on some of the things that you can do as a parent to manage your child with ADHD. As always, if you have any comments, questions, concerns, or just want to share a story, please write to us in the comments section, and we look forward to hearing from you. So thanks, and see you next lesson.